November 3rd, 1946, 14:15 hours. Former RAF station, Bedfordshire, England. Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway of what had been designated Hut 7, Section B, and tried not to cry. Behind her, a lorry idled with the few possessions she and her husband had salvaged from their bombed house in Portsmouth. A tea service that had belonged to her grandmother, some clothes, a few photographs, William's demob suit still in its wrapping. Inside the hut, bare corrugated steel curved overhead in a half-cylinder that looked more like a storage shed than a home. The floor was concrete. A single small stove sat in the center, its chimney pipe extending through a hole cut in the steel roof. Two narrow windows admitted grey November light that did nothing to warm the space. This was it. This was where they would live, where they would try to build a life after 6 years of war that had killed Margaret's brother, wounded her husband, and destroyed the home they'd bought 3 years into their marriage. A curved steel tube, 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, divided by plywood partitions into 3 flats that shared the same cold space and single coal stove. No running water inside. That came from a pump outside that served the entire row of huts. Toilet facilities in a separate structure 50 yards away. William came up behind her, limping slightly from the wound that had sent him home from Italy in 1944. He looked at the hut, at his wife's face, and tried to find something encouraging to say. "Well," he managed finally, "at least it's not raining inside." Margaret laughed, a sound somewhere between humor and despair. "No," she agreed, "at least there's that." They unloaded their lorry and began the process of turning military structure into something resembling home. Because that was what one did. Britain had survived the war. Now it had to survive the peace. And if that meant living in repurposed army huts, then that's what British families would do. They'd make do. They'd carry on. They'd find ways to make cold steel into warm homes because the alternative was unthinkable. The arithmetic of destruction. Britain emerged from World War II militarily victorious and domestically devastated in ways that statistics couldn't fully capture. The bombing campaign that Germany had waged against British cities from 1940 through 1945 had destroyed or seriously damaged approximately 4 million homes. London alone had lost roughly 1/3 of its housing stock to bombs and fires. Coventry's city centre had been obliterated in November 1940. Hull, Plymouth, Bristol, Southampton, Birmingham, every major city and many smaller ones bore scars from bombing that had killed 60,000 British civilians and left hundreds of thousands homeless. The damage wasn't just physical. Britain's economy was exhausted, its resources depleted by 6 years of total war. The nation had spent everything to survive and prevail, leaving almost nothing for reconstruction. Building materials were scarce. Timber needed for pit props in coal mines, steel required for rebuilding industry, cement rationed for critical infrastructure projects. Skilled construction workers were still being demobilized from military service, returning to civilian economy gradually. The housing shortage wasn't just a matter of damaged buildings, but of fundamental inability to rebuild quickly enough to meet need. The mathematics were brutal. Britain needed millions of new homes, but could build perhaps 100,000 per year using traditional construction methods with available resources. At that rate, housing shortage would persist for decades, leaving families in temporary accommodation or worse, through children's entire childhoods. The crisis demanded solutions that were immediate, even if imperfect, that could be implemented quickly with available resources, that would provide shelter now, rather than ideal housing eventually. The government's response drew on wartime experience with rapid construction and temporary structures. During the war, Britain had built thousands of structures using prefabricated methods, putting up camps and facilities in weeks rather than months. Those same methods, applied to civilian housing, might address the immediate crisis while traditional rebuilding proceeded in parallel. The solution wouldn't be elegant or permanent, but it would be fast and functional, precisely what circumstances required. The inventor's practical mind. The Nissen hut, named for its designer Major Peter Norman Nissen of the Royal Engineers, represented military engineering's approach to solving problems. Identify minimum requirements, design simplest possible solution, make it producible and transportable. Nissen had developed the design in 1916, during World War I, when British forces in France needed shelter that could be erected quickly behind lines, transported easily, and constructed by soldiers with minimal training and tools. His solution was elegantly simple: a semi-cylindrical structure of corrugated iron sheets bolted to a steel frame, with wooden end walls containing door and window openings. The curved shape provided strength, like an arch, distributing loads efficiently, while the corrugated iron was readily available, lightweight and weatherproof. A team of 6 men could erect a standard hut in 4 hours using only wrenches and basic hand tools. The design proved so successful that it remained essentially unchanged through World War II. The British military produced Nissen huts by the thousands, shipping them worldwide to every theatre where British forces operated. In North Africa, they withstood desert heat and sandstorms. In the Arctic, they provided shelter against brutal cold. In the Pacific, they resisted tropical humidity and monsoons. They served as barracks, hospitals, mess halls, command posts, storage facilities, workshops, churches, cinemas. Any function requiring covered space could be accommodated by appropriate arrangement and fitting out of the basic structure. The hut's military service revealed both strengths and weaknesses that would later matter for civilian use. They were indeed quick to erect and required no specialized construction skills. They were durable, properly assembled and maintained. They lasted years despite being temporary structures. They were adaptable. Interior arrangements could be modified easily to suit different purposes, but they were also uncomfortable. The metal construction conducted heat readily, making them ovens in summer and freezers in winter unless insulated and heated. Condensation formed on interior surfaces in humid conditions. The curved walls made furniture arrangement difficult and reduced usable floor space. They were noisy in rain or wind, the metal drumming and rattling in ways that made sleep difficult. For military use, these disadvantages were acceptable. Soldiers could be ordered to live in uncomfortable quarters, and military facilities provided communal services that reduced individual huts' deficiencies. But converting these structures to family housing would require addressing their worst characteristics while accepting that perfection wasn't achievable given resource constraints and urgency of need. From camps to communities. The transition from military to civilian use began with structures already in place across Britain, particularly the numerous camps that had housed military personnel, prisoners of war, and various wartime functions. By 1945, Britain hosted approximately 400,000 German and Italian POWs in camps scattered across the country, most consisting primarily of Nissen huts arranged in organized layouts with communal facilities. As these prisoners were gradually repatriated through 1946 and 1947, their camps became available for other uses. Simultaneously, military bases were closing as forces demobilized, releasing thousands of additional Nissen huts that had housed British service members. The government's emergency housing program, announced in 1944 and expanded after war's end, designated many of these sites for conversion to temporary civilian accommodation. The camp's existing infrastructure, roads, water supply, sewerage, electricity where available, made them practical choices despite their often remote locations. Converting them required relatively modest investment, partitioning huts into family units, installing cooking facilities, providing furniture and basic amenities, improving insulation and heating where possible. The standards varied considerably. Some conversions were thoughtful and relatively comfortable, huts properly insulated, equipped with decent stoves, provided with adequate furniture and facilities. Others were barely modified from military specification, with families expected to make do with minimal heating, shared facilities, and improvised domestic arrangements. The variation reflected resource constraints, local authority competence, and simple luck about which Camp 1 was assigned to. Margaret and William Whitmore's hut in Bedfordshire represented middle tier of quality. The RAF station had been substantial installation during the war, with good basic infrastructure. Their section of Hut 7 measured roughly 16 feet by 12 feet, small but not impossibly so for childless couple. The hut had been minimally insulated with compressed fiber board on interior walls, providing some thermal protection. The coal stove, while inadequate for truly cold weather, could keep space marginally warm if fed constantly. They shared water pump and toilets with 3 other families in adjacent huts, an arrangement that required coordination but was workable. Their neighbors in the other sections of Hut 7 became immediately important to survival and sanity. The Johnsons had 2 small children and consequently commanded priority access to water pump for washing. The Patel family recently arrived from India, where Mr. Patel had served in the Indian Army, navigated British winter with good humor, and shared techniques for staying warm that they'd learned in Himalayan mountain stations. Everyone helped everyone else because no family could manage in isolation. Watching children while mothers queued for rations, sharing fuel when someone ran short before next allocation, lending tools and expertise for endless small repairs that communal living demanded. Making do. The process of turning military structures into homes required creativity, determination, and acceptance that comfort would be relative rather than absolute. Margaret attacked their space with energy, born from relief at having any home at all. The concrete floor was cold and hard, so she and William scrounged linoleum from a salvage yard in the nearby town, patching together enough to cover most of the floor. The corrugated walls were depressing bare metal, so Margaret made curtains from parachute silk that William had acquired through mysterious military surplus channels, hanging them to soften the space and provide some sound dampening. They built simple furniture from scavenged wood, shelves for their few possessions, a table and chairs made from ammunition crates and rough lumber, a partition screen to separate sleeping area from living space. The coal stove became center of domestic life and constant source of anxiety. It needed feeding every few hours to maintain minimal warmth, consuming coal allocated through rationing that never quite seemed sufficient. On coldest winter nights, ice formed on interior walls despite the stove's best efforts, and families woke to frozen water in basins. Margaret learned to bank the fire carefully at night, achieving slow burn that lasted until morning, rather than hot fire that exhausted coal supply but left them cold by dawn. She learned which positions near the stove were warmest, arranging their limited furniture to maximize benefit from its heat. Water management required careful planning. The pump outside served multiple families and froze regularly in winter, requiring someone to thaw it each morning by wrapping it in rags soaked with hot water carried from someone's stove. Margaret established routine. Fill kettle and pots each morning for days cooking and washing, minimizing trips outside in bad weather. Laundry was a particular challenge. Washing clothes required heating substantial water, performing the wash, then drying clothes in space that was already cramped. She learned to do laundry on days when weather permitted hanging clothes outside and to arrange drying racks near the stove on wet days, even though this made space nearly unbearable with humidity. Cooking on the coal stove required relearning techniques Margaret had used as child before her family had acquired proper cooker. The stove's top surface served as cooking area, with temperature controlled by adjusting coal feed and positioning pots nearer or farther from hottest spots. She couldn't bake, no oven existed, so she learned to steam puddings and make stovetop dishes that stretched limited ingredients. Neighbors shared recipes and techniques, a collective education in poverty cooking that many had last employed during Depression years before the war. But gradually, through months of effort and adjustment, Hut 7 Section B became recognizable as home. Margaret's curtains softened the metal walls. Photographs of family and William's unit in Italy created focal points of memory and identity. The tea service that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother sat on their homemade shelf, providing connection to destroyed house and to normalcy they were trying to rebuild. Small touches, a rug near the door, plants in tin cans on the windowsill, William's careful lettering on a wooden sign reading "The Whitmores," transformed anonymous military structure into space that was theirs, however imperfect. The adaptation. Across Britain, similar transformations were occurring in thousands of huts as families adapted to circumstances that were simultaneously impossible and unavoidable. The communities that formed in these temporary housing settlements developed their own characters and social structures. Residents organized committees to manage shared facilities and advocate with authorities for improvements. They established systems for maintaining order and cleanliness in communal areas. They created social activities, community meetings, children's activities, celebrations of holidays and milestones that helped transform collections of huts into actual communities. Children adapted most readily, finding advantages adults couldn't see. The open areas between huts became playgrounds where dozens of children could play together, supervised casually by mothers whose huts all faced the common area. The strange architecture became setting for elaborate games. Huts transformed into spaceships or submarines or castles, depending on children's imaginations. Kids who might have grown up in separate houses instead formed tight-knit groups, forged by shared experience of growing up in Tin Town. Adults found adaptation harder, but managed through necessity. Men returning from military service had experience with rough living and communal arrangements that helped them adjust. Women, who bore primary responsibility for maintaining households under these difficult conditions, developed expertise and resilience that their pre-war lives might not have demanded. Elderly residents struggled most. The cold was harder on older bodies, the physical demands of hauling water and fuel more difficult, the lack of privacy more wearing. Communities generally rallied to help their oldest residents, but the conditions were undeniably hard on those least equipped to endure them. The settlements also revealed class tensions that British society preferred to ignore. Professional families and working-class families found themselves as neighbors in huts that looked identical from outside, creating proximity that peacetime housing patterns usually prevented. Some adapted gracefully, discovering common ground in shared hardship. Others maintained careful distance, recreating class boundaries through subtle markers of speech, association, and attitude despite living in identical circumstances. Local communities' relationships with the hut settlements varied from acceptance to hostility. Some towns welcomed the additional population and purchasing power, integrating the settlements into community life. Others resented the newcomers, seeing them as temporary residents who didn't really belong, whose children crowded schools, whose presence reminded everyone of war's disruption. The settlements themselves often reinforced this separation, being physically isolated from town centers, creating communities that were simultaneously part of local area and separate from it, the temporary that lasted. The huts had been designated emergency accommodation, expected to serve 5 years at most, while proper housing was constructed. Reality proved different. Britain's post-war recovery was slower than optimists had hoped. Economic austerity persisted through the late 1940s. Building materials remained scarce. Traditional house construction proceeded but couldn't keep pace with demand from population growth, household formation, and continued replacement of war damage. The temporary huts that were supposed to last until 1950 were still housing families in 1955, and some remained occupied into the 1960s. The Whitmores lived in Hut 7 Section B for 9 years. Their first child was born in 1948, delivered in the local hospital but brought home to the hut that Margaret had somehow made welcoming despite its limitations. The baby's arrival made the space impossibly cramped. Where did one put a cot, change nappies, store baby clothes in 16 by 12 feet already filled with adult life? Margaret made it work through organization that bordered on obsessive, through accepting that nothing could be left out casually, through learning to function in space that allowed no margin for disorder. William found work at a local factory, walking 3 miles each direction because they couldn't afford bicycle. His wages were modest but steady, allowing them to save small amounts toward eventual proper house. They applied repeatedly for council housing, their names on waiting lists that seemed never to advance. Meanwhile, they improved their hut incrementally, better insulation purchased and installed over several months, a small paraffin heater for bitter nights, linoleum replaced when original wore through, curtains upgraded from parachute silk to proper fabric bought at great expense. The hut weathered Britain's weather with varying success. Summer heat was manageable. They could open windows and door for ventilation, spend time outside where grass and flowers they'd planted created small garden. Winter was harder each year, the cold seeming more penetrating, the effort of staying warm more exhausting. The roof leaked occasionally despite William's repairs, requiring pots positioned to catch drips until he could patch the problem. Wind rattled the structure, making sleep difficult during storms, but it remained weatherproof enough, kept them dry and marginally warm, provided roof that didn't collapse or walls that didn't fail. The final transition. When the Whitmores finally received allocation for Council House in 1955, Margaret's reaction was complex rather than simple joy. The new house was everything the hut wasn't. Proper brick construction, separate bedrooms, indoor plumbing, central heating, a garden with fence around it. It represented normalcy, the life they'd expected to live before the war disrupted everything, the home their child deserved. But leaving the hut meant leaving community they'd built over 9 years, neighbors who'd become friends through shared hardship, the place where their son had taken first steps and spoken first words. The day they moved, neighbors gathered to help load their possessions and say goodbye. Mrs. Johnson cried, though she insisted it was just dust in her eyes. Mr. Patel shook William's hand and said simply, "You were good neighbors." The hut stood empty after they left, waiting for its next occupants, or perhaps for demolition. Margaret didn't know and couldn't quite bring herself to ask. Across Britain, this scene repeated thousands of times through the 1950s and early 1960s as families graduated from temporary huts to permanent housing. Some settlements were demolished entirely, the huts dismantled or repurposed. Others lingered, partially occupied, gradually deteriorating. A few huts were purchased by their occupants and modified extensively into acceptable permanent homes. Properly insulated, connected to utilities, made comfortable through investment that the government had never authorized but couldn't prevent. The huts themselves proved remarkably durable. Structures designed to last 5 years routinely stood for decades. Some were converted to agricultural use, storage sheds, animal shelters, workshops. Others became garden sheds, garages, or commercial storage. The basic design was sound enough that proper maintenance could extend useful life almost indefinitely, though few structures received such maintenance after civilian housing use ended. By the 1970s, most huts were gone, removed as eyesores or safety hazards, replaced by proper housing, or returned to agricultural land. But scattered examples remained, some still inhabited by elderly occupants who'd lived in them for decades and refused to leave, others preserved accidentally through neglect or deliberately as historical curiosities. The unglamorous truth: the Nissen huts weren't triumph of British ingenuity or testament to resilient spirit, though they were evidence of both. They were pragmatic response to desperate circumstances, temporary measures that became semi-permanent because rebuilding a nation proved harder and slower than anyone had hoped. The families who lived in them did so because they had no choice, making the best of situations that were genuinely difficult while waiting for better options that came slowly or sometimes not at all. What remained after the huts were gone was memory of time when British families had survived in corrugated steel cylinders, had made homes from military structures, had raised children and built lives in spaces that should have been temporary but became defining experiences. Not glory, but endurance. Not heroism, but determination. Not grand narrative, but simple truth of people doing what they had to do because the alternative was unthinkable. The ugly huts that nobody wanted became homes because homes were what people made them, through effort and love and refusal to give up, even when circumstances seemed impossible. That was Britain after the war. Not glamorous, not comfortable, just persistent, carrying on through hardship until something better became possible. The Nissen huts, ugly and inadequate and somehow sufficient, stood as monuments to that persistence until they were finally, mercifully, replaced by the proper houses that should have been built years earlier but somehow never were until far too late for those who'd needed them most.